If the president were to send national troops to your city or a city nearby you, would you support or oppose? I'm convinced the real divide in American politics isn't so much race or party or ideology or even age, but location, where you live. Why is that? Because where you live is your playing field. It's October 15th, and it's another edition of Real Polling in Real Time with Zogby. And I'm Jeremy Zogby. I'm managing partner of Zogby Strategies. And always, I'm here with my dad, my partner, the founder of Zogby Polling and of Zogby Strategies. And he could not make it today. And so I'm flying solo, but we have a new poll, a national poll of likely voters that we sent out yesterday. And so I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the highlights of that. And if you haven't had a chance, you go on our website, johnzogbystrategies.com, under the news button, and you will see an October 14th release about the president's approval rating, as well as the biggest domestic issue being talked about right now, and that is the president sending in the National Guard troops into large cities like Chicago, LA, Memphis. And so we had a real interesting twist on that. And there are all kinds of perceptions about how the president is really doing. And so here we are, Zogby Strategies, breaking down the reality versus people's perceptions of what they get in the news. And so what we're showing in our recent poll is that the president has an approval rating of 44%, which is a little bit down from the last time we did our last national poll in late August, where he went up to 46. His disapproval is at 51%. That's a slight majority of American voters who disapprove of his overall job in the White House. But that's the overall picture. What happens when we drill down to key issues, especially key issues that the Trump administration is talking about on a daily basis? Of course, that would include immigration and the southern border policies, which the president is above water, well above water, with 52 approving and 42% disapproving. That's 10 percentage points above water. American voters, in short, are fairly approving of the president's policies with that regard. When we go down to handling the economy, it reverses: 42% approve, 52% disapprove. I'm just going to go through one other issue, and that's negotiating with world leaders. We see that all the time in the news today, as I referenced, and that the president is slightly above water. The perception from voters is that the president gets a 47% approval rating, a 46% disapproval rating. Okay, so that's just the monthly polling that we've been doing all year long, tracking. But as I mentioned, there's a much bigger issue on the domestic front, and that ties into crime and how the president is dealing with crime and his approach, which is pretty intense. The notion of sending in National Guard troops into these large cities where, crime, a lot of voters feel that crime is on the rise. And so rather than just asking generically whether they approve or disapprove or support or oppose, I thought it was important to personalize the question. That's very key. And the question goes, if the president were to send national troops to your city or a city nearby you, would you support or oppose? How strongly would you support? Strongly support, somewhat oppose, or strongly oppose. And this is revealing. This shows where we voters are today in the thick of this moment. Overall results, 47% of voters support, 49% oppose. That's a deeply divided nation over a very intense topic. But that's just the average. What happens when we drill down and we look at key voting blocks and key voting segments? We look at white voters, they're evenly split. 48% support, 48% oppose. What about non-white voters? That would consist of those who are African American, Hispanic, Asian, or other mixed races. 45% support, 51 oppose. I think the next important thing to look at would be location, meaning where do these voters live? Are they in large cities, small cities, suburbs, or rural America? Well, because the topic is inherently about large cities, we zero in on one of the largest cohorts, that is those voters who live in the big cities, in the big urban areas. And this might be shocking because I don't think this is something you'll get in the news. This is why I'm talking about the reality versus the perception. And so the numbers go like this. When you look at large city voters with regards to the president deploying National Guard troops to their cities, not just cities in general, but their city. And what we find is 48% support and 48% oppose, meaning the nation as a whole is very divided over this issue. But then when we break down the key segments, whether it's white versus non-white or looking at urban dwellers, it's also intensely divided. And so that has immense implications for intensity, which is something that, we in this field are always trying to measure. And that intensity as the backdrop as we move closer into the midterm elections. But while I talk about this deep division, there was another question that we asked in the survey, which the results were quite astounding. We're at a point now where baby boomers, those born between 1945 and the early 60s, depending on how you measure that, they're becoming less in terms of population size, and millennials and Gen Z are becoming greater. They're basically a plurality of voters, if not close to it. And, the two names that are buzzing in this country the most at this moment, who are young, who are, we could say, political leaders, is Mamdani, running for mayor of New York City, which every poll is showing he's well ahead. And, as of today, it looks like he's going to win. And then, of course, there was the now deceased Charlie Kirk. But he's still a major factor in politics because his organization, Turning Point USA, is growing by the week. We asked in the poll among voters which personality more closely aligned with their values. And not surprisingly, we had more voters say it was Charlie Kirk. And I'd say that really breaks down because of something called, what I call the martyr effect. His passing, his assassination, put him front and center in the news cycle, and more people learned about him than ever, and there's that rising popularity. And so, that's no surprise when we test the names. But what happens when we test those two figures and their visions without the name? And that's where things get really interesting. And so I have those poll numbers, and I'm going to share them with you. And first, Let me read for you how respondents actually saw this question. And so it was a statement A versus statement B, which comes closer to your view. Statement A says, using the power of the government and the will of the people to make a more equitable distribution of wealth, to address housing affordability, childcare, raising the minimum wage, all accomplished by increasing taxes on billionaires to fund these social programs. That is the classic socialist position, and particularly with a Mamdani twist for his campaign in New York. That's the Mamdani vision for America. Versus statement B, which says patriotism and pride in the United States rooted in the nation's founding, an emphasis on limited government, lower taxes, and free markets as the engine of upward mobility in achieving the American dream. Also, the exercise of freedoms in the Bill of Rights and traditional family values as the backbone to a strong national identity. And that right there, I think, perfectly sums up in 2 or 3 sentences the vision that Charlie Kirk had and his organization has for the future of America. But overall, again, here we see deep division. Without having names attached to these visions, 42% of voters sided with Mamdani's vision of America versus 39%, almost the same amount, who sided with Charlie Kirk's vision for the future of America. So 42 to 39, that's what we call a deep division. What happens when we zero in on younger voters, particularly the sub-cohort that I like to focus on, those ages 25 to 34, because those are the folks who are starting to think about the future, who are starting to think about careers and maybe even settling down. 40% of that age group side with the Mamdani vision, 38% side with Charlie Kirk's vision. What happens when we drill down to location? Now, why I want to look at location is because I'm convinced the real divide in American politics isn't so much race or party or ideology or even age, but location, where you live. Why is that? Because where you live is your playing field. When you live in a large urban city, how you go about your day is very much different from somebody who lives in a small city versus someone who lives in a small town, a village, or out in the suburbs, or in the rural parts of America. No surprise, 50% side with Mamdani. What I'm a little surprised is that 31% side with Charlie Kirk. I think a lot of folks wouldn't necessarily expect that. But nonetheless, Charlie Kirk's vision has carved out a niche among those who live in large cities. When we go down to small cities, it narrows a little bit. 47% of small city voters side with Mamdani, 34% with Kirk. And then as we get to the suburbs, it flips 43% in favor of the Kirk vision, 37% in favor of the Mamdani vision, split, but nonetheless more siding with Kirk. And then, of course, you go rural, and 46% of rural voters side with Kirk, 36% side with Mamdani. Hence why I'm saying this is the real divide. You have both visions that have carved themselves out in all of these, in the whole range of locations within the United States. And the big takeaway from that is this is the real story. So in short, I tried to cover some angles that, while they do have presence in what we're seeing in the political debate from news sources, I think these are angles that we often overlook. There's a lot of intensity coming from the camp who are against the president, and there's a lot of intensity from the camp who are in support of the president, and both live in their own realities. When we drill down to the issues of importance, like crime and immigration, we see different numbers, but we can't lose sight of where everything is headed. And that's why the next question, in terms of Mamdani versus Charlie Kirk, or traditional values versus urban values, is important. And I urge everybody to take a look at the press release on our website, johnzogbystrategies.com, and to dive into some of those numbers, and to also watch out for this growing sentiment of ideas branded as socialism versus ideas branded as traditional values, particularly looking at youth voters. And that's where the real battle is going to be. And as always, we'll see you next time with more polling data and more insights on what's happening in the political landscape.